Today, what I want to talk to you about is a study that we did. Krista Johnston, who will be talking next, a wonderful clinical graduate student at SFU in my autism lab. We did this study, but before we get into the study itself, I wanted to give you just a little bit of background and also some reflections based on both my clinical work and my reading of the literature on how anxiety, internalizing symptoms might look a little different in people with ASD. So there is a national strategy on mental health in Canada. I don't know if any of you know about it. It does exist since 2012, and there are some clear sorts of strategies that have been outlined, things like promote mental health across the lifespan, foster recovery, well-being for people of all ages, provide access to the right combination of services, treatments, and supports, reduce disparities in access to mental health services, work with First Nation, Inuit, and Métis to address their specific mental health needs, and to mobilize leadership initiatives, improve knowledge, collaboration around mental health. They all sound great, and it's a wonderful document. If you'd like to read it, I provided the link there. However, the implications for people with developmental disabilities at this point are very unclear in the document. So it doesn't tell us very much at all about how the national strategy on mental health is going to help people with developmental disabilities. And the additional problem we have is that health, education, most of our ministries are provincially funded and provincially managed. And so any data that we collect is specific to the province. And so it's going to be difficult when we try to compare or pool data together to try to figure out, what are the issues that we're having? How do we address these issues specifically for people with developmental disabilities? But in any case, despite those challenges, I think it's really critical that we start to do more. As Jonathan mentioned this morning, there is a lot of research out there, but it's not very specific to our own context here in Canada. I think we need to do more research to eventually inform policy so that eventually we will see policy changes. I know here in British Columbia, the mental health group is really trying to work together to do this because we know it's important here. There's a real lack of initiative on mental health and people with developmental disabilities. What we need to do is really try to provide more information about how significant this problem is, the kinds of things that make mental health issues more significant for people on the spectrum, and also how can we treat this particular problem. So, based both on my reading of the literature on autism and anxiety in particular, because this seems to be the most prevalent problem in people with ASD, and also based on clinical work that I've done with this population, I just want to go through a few things that I think are important to understand as a background to why mental health issues might be a little bit more challenging to treat in people with ASD, but also some of the benefits and of the approaches that we have that could actually be very well suited for people on the spectrum. So children with autism spectrum disorder are at much higher risk for anxiety in particular. The rates range from 11 to 84%. And in depression, they range from 1.5 to 48%. They're quite high, but you see there's a significant discrepancy from one study to the next, and that's likely due to the kinds of questions that they ask, the methods that they use. But regardless, the rates are quite high. For high-functioning individuals with ASD, we keep using this term. I don't think it's necessarily the most appropriate term, but it refers to people who are who don't have an intellectual disability. And so for people who have autism but not intellectual disability, there seems to be a particularly high risk of certain kinds of mental health problems. And this is likely due to the fact that people who have higher intellectual ability are able to have more sophisticated sort of ideas and ways of thinking about things, and have more, possibly more things to worry about. And so this is a subgroup that people are thinking we need to study more to understand more about their experience. Now, one of the anxiety disorders that is particularly high in terms of rates, as high as 49% of people on the spectrum, is social anxiety. And this is something that, again, we suspect, is it possible that social anxiety is a disorder in and of itself that is additional or comorbid to ASD, or is it possible that because of some of the ASD symptoms that we're seeing higher rates of the disorder being diagnosed? And I think we really still need research to understand that. So some of the signs of anxiety in people with ASD might be expressed a little bit differently than what we would see in children or adults without ASD. In children, we tend to see things like silly behavior, some irritability, inattention, hyperactivity or underactivity, neutral or blank expressions where you can't really tell that the child is anxious. You also might see changes in sleep patterns, eating, physical symptoms, but these are not always reliable indicators as they would be in typically developing kids, because the problems might have been there all along. And so sometimes you might see a change, but other times the parents will say, well, they've always had problems sleeping. And so it becomes a little bit more challenging to diagnose. Then internalizing behaviors may be absent or coupled with externalizing behaviors. Typically, psychologists like to categorize behaviors, and we say internalizing behaviors like anxiety and depression tend to go together, and you tend not to see those together with acting out or conduct or behavior problems. But in kids with ASD, actually, you probably often see the two together rather than separate. And so you will see aggression, tantrums, refusal behaviors, increased rigidity, and teachers, and I've had this exact conversation with some teachers, will say, well, he's just defiant and acting out and doesn't want to do anything. And they attribute it to bad behavior or lack of respect for adults and so on. But they don't always see the anxiety behind that behavior. Approach and avoidance are equally likely responses to threat. I remember a young boy who was in high school at the time, around 15 years old, who said that he was worried that one of his childhood friends, so elementary school friends, who happened to be a girl, was no longer interested in being his friend, and so he was very worried about it. He thought about it all the time, he dreamt about it, and so his approach was, well, I'm going to follow her around everywhere to make sure she knows I'm still here. So that's not necessarily the typical response of an adolescent who is worried about a girl liking him or being friends with him. But in a child with autism, that is sometimes a behavior, and it looks like, you know, it's stalking behavior or it's inappropriate social behavior. But it could, the underlying feeling could be anxiety.